Question 1. The evaluation methodology shows that when reviewing an application for a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota, an officer encounters information suggesting a past domestic dispute that was not formally charged. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the procedural and legal requirements for processing this application? Option A. Postpone the decision indefinitely until more information about the domestic dispute becomes available, without actively seeking to obtain it. Option B. Immediately deny the permit application based on the suggestion of a domestic dispute, as such incidents are generally viewed negatively in permit reviews. Option C. Conduct a thorough background investigation, including contacting the involved parties if legally permissible, and reviewing any available police reports or related documentation to determine if the incident constitutes a disqualifying factor under Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, while also verifying all other statutory eligibility criteria. Option D. Accept the applicant's statement that the dispute was minor and did not result in charges, and proceed with issuing the permit without further investigation into the incident. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough background investigation, including contacting the involved parties if legally permissible, and reviewing any available police reports or related documentation to determine if the incident constitutes a disqualifying factor under Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, while also verifying all other statutory eligibility criteria. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that understanding the nuances of permit application review is paramount for law enforcement officers. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the applicant's right to seek a permit with the public's safety and the strict legal requirements for permit issuance. Misinterpreting or misapplying these requirements can lead to either the unlawful issuance of a permit or the unjust denial of a constitutionally protected right. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections related to permits to carry a pistol, and relevant case law, while also considering the totality of the circumstances presented by the applicant. The best professional practice involves a thorough review of all submitted documentation and a comprehensive background check that strictly adheres to the criteria outlined in Minnesota law for permit eligibility. This includes verifying the applicant's age, residency, absence of disqualifying criminal convictions, and any documented history of mental instability or domestic violence that would preclude permit issuance under state statute. The officer must meticulously cross-reference information from various sources, including criminal history databases, court records, and mental health records where legally permissible and relevant, to ensure no disqualifying factors are overlooked. This systematic and legally grounded approach ensures that the decision is based solely on objective, statutory criteria, thereby upholding both public safety and the applicant's rights. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a single source of information without cross-verification, such as accepting a self-reported absence of criminal history without independently checking official records. This fails to meet the statutory requirement for due diligence and could result in a permit being issued to an ineligible individual. Another incorrect approach is to deny a permit based on unsubstantiated rumors or personal biases rather than documented evidence that directly contravenes the statutory eligibility requirements. This violates the applicant's right to a fair process and potentially infringes upon their Second Amendment rights, as interpreted by Minnesota law. Furthermore, delaying the review process indefinitely without a valid legal reason or failing to communicate the reasons for denial clearly and in writing, as required by statute, constitutes a procedural failure that undermines the integrity of the permit system. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to statutory mandates, objective evidence, and procedural fairness. This involves a step-by-step verification process, documenting each stage of the review, and consulting legal counsel or supervisors when encountering ambiguous situations or complex disqualifying factors. The focus must always remain on whether the applicant meets all the affirmative requirements for a permit and whether any disqualifying factors are present, as defined by Minnesota law. Question 2. Quality control measures reveal that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has submitted an application form stating a current address within the county, but the provided utility bill, intended as proof of residency, lists an address in a different state. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Sheriff's Office to ensure compliance with Minnesota statutes regarding permit issuance? Option A. Approve the permit application, relying on the applicant's statement of residency and disregarding the conflicting utility bill. Option B. Request clarification from the applicant regarding the discrepancy in residency information and require further documentation to verify their Minnesota residency before proceeding with the application review. Option C. Submit the application for further review, assuming the applicant will provide correct information if questioned later in the process. Option D. Forward the application to the state for a final decision, as the residency discrepancy is a matter for state-level determination. The correct answer is B. Request clarification from the applicant regarding the discrepancy in residency information and require further documentation to verify their Minnesota residency before proceeding with the application review. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to demonstrate not only knowledge of firearm safety and legal requirements, but also the ability to accurately and truthfully represent their personal history. Misrepresenting information on a permit application, even if unintentional, can have serious legal consequences and jeopardize the applicant's ability to obtain or maintain a permit. The Sheriff's Office has a duty to ensure all applicants meet the statutory requirements for carrying a pistol, and thoroughness in reviewing applications is paramount to public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to meticulously review the application for any inconsistencies or omissions, cross-referencing information provided with supporting documentation where necessary, and to seek clarification from the applicant directly if any ambiguities arise. This approach aligns with Minnesota Statute Section 624(713), which outlines the requirements for obtaining a permit to carry a pistol. Specifically, the statute requires applicants to provide truthful and complete information. By proactively identifying and addressing potential issues before a decision is made, the Sheriff's Office upholds its responsibility to enforce the law accurately and fairly, ensuring that only qualified individuals receive permits. This also provides the applicant with an opportunity to correct any errors or provide necessary context, promoting transparency and due process. Incorrect approaches analysis. Submitting the application for review without verifying the applicant's stated residency, despite the application form explicitly requiring proof of residency and the applicant having provided a utility bill from a different state, is a regulatory failure. Minnesota Statute Section 624(713), Subdivision 2(a)(1) requires the applicant to be a resident of the state. Failing to verify this fundamental requirement means the Sheriff's Office is not adequately ensuring compliance with state law. Approving the permit application solely based on the applicant's assertion of residency, without reviewing the provided documentation which clearly indicates a different state of residence, is a significant ethical and regulatory lapse. This bypasses the established process for verifying eligibility and could lead to a permit being issued to an individual who does not meet the statutory residency requirement, potentially compromising public safety. Forwarding the application to the next stage of review without addressing the discrepancy in the applicant's stated address and the address on the provided utility bill, assuming the applicant will clarify if questioned later, is an abdication of responsibility. The Sheriff's Office has a duty to conduct a thorough review at each stage. This approach relies on a passive correction rather than an active verification of compliance with Minnesota Statute Section 624(713), Subdivision 2(a)(1). Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a proactive and diligent approach to application review. The decision-making process should involve a systematic verification of all submitted information against statutory requirements and supporting documentation. When discrepancies are identified, the immediate professional response is to seek clarification and verification from the applicant or through other authorized means. This ensures that decisions are based on accurate information and full compliance with the law, thereby upholding public trust and safety. The principle is to verify, not to assume, and to address all potential issues before making a final determination. Question 3. Risk assessment procedures indicate that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol must demonstrate a clear understanding of the legal parameters for the use of deadly force. Which of the following best reflects the applicant's required understanding for a successful application? Option A. The applicant must be able to articulate a specific scenario where they reasonably believe their life or the life of another was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, necessitating the use of deadly force. Option B. The applicant must express a general desire for personal protection and a belief that carrying a firearm acts as a deterrent to crime. Option C. The applicant must demonstrate an understanding that possessing a firearm is sufficient to justify its use in any situation where they feel threatened. Option D. The applicant must convey that the right to carry a pistol inherently grants the authority to use it whenever they perceive a potential threat. The correct answer is A. The applicant must be able to articulate a specific scenario where they reasonably believe their life or the life of another was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm, necessitating the use of deadly force. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to demonstrate a thorough understanding of Minnesota's legal framework for carrying a pistol, specifically concerning the nuances of self-defense and the permissible use of force. Misinterpreting these provisions can lead to a denial of the permit, or worse, legal repercussions if the applicant misunderstands their rights and responsibilities. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between lawful defensive actions and unlawful aggression. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves accurately identifying that Minnesota law, under Min. Stat. Section 624, 714 sub. 6 permits the use of deadly force only when necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to oneself or another, or to prevent the commission of a violent crime. This approach correctly emphasizes that the applicant's understanding must align with the statutory definition of justifiable self-defense, focusing on the imminent threat of serious harm. It requires the applicant to articulate a situation where their life or the life of another was in immediate danger, necessitating the use of deadly force. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that suggests the permit can be obtained by simply stating a general fear of crime or a desire for personal protection without articulating a specific, imminent threat of death or great bodily harm fails to meet the legal standard. Minnesota law does not grant a permit based on generalized anxieties. Another incorrect approach would be to focus on the mere possession of a firearm as a deterrent, without demonstrating an understanding of the legal justifications for its use. This overlooks the critical aspect of the permit application, which is the applicant's capacity to lawfully carry, and if necessary, use a firearm in self-defense according to statutory guidelines. Finally, an approach that conflates the right to bear arms with an unrestricted right to use force in any perceived threatening situation is fundamentally flawed. It ignores the legal limitations and responsibilities inherent in carrying a concealed weapon, particularly the requirement for a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this by first thoroughly reviewing the relevant Minnesota statutes pertaining to the permit to carry a pistol and the use of deadly force. They must then analyze the applicant's responses against these specific legal requirements, looking for an articulation that demonstrates an understanding of imminent threat and the necessity of force to prevent death or great bodily harm. This involves distinguishing between subjective feelings of fear and objective legal justifications for the use of deadly force. Question 4. The monitoring system demonstrates that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a history of domestic violence incidents, some of which were dismissed and did not result in a conviction. Which approach best aligns with the requirements for a truthful and complete permit application? Option A. Disclose all domestic violence incidents, including those that were dismissed, as part of the application. Option B. State on the application that only convictions are relevant, and therefore no further information on domestic violence is provided. Option C. Only disclose domestic violence incidents that resulted in a conviction, as dismissed cases are not legally relevant. Option D. Submit the application without mentioning any domestic violence incidents, assuming the system will only flag convictions. Correct answer is A. Disclose all domestic violence incidents, including those that were dismissed, as part of the application. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the legal requirements for carrying a pistol in Minnesota, specifically concerning the application process and the information that must be disclosed. Misrepresenting information or failing to disclose relevant details can have serious legal consequences, including denial of the permit, revocation of a previously issued permit, and potential criminal charges. The applicant's obligation is to be truthful and complete in their submission. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the applicant providing accurate and complete information on the permit application, including any prior instances of domestic violence, regardless of whether they resulted in a conviction or were dismissed. Minnesota law, specifically Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, addresses the criteria for permit eligibility and requires disclosure of relevant history. Failing to disclose a domestic violence incident, even if it did not lead to a conviction, could be interpreted as a misrepresentation or omission of material fact, which is grounds for denial or revocation of a permit. Honesty and full disclosure are paramount to fulfilling the legal and ethical obligations of the application process. Incorrect approach is analysis. Providing only information about convictions and omitting dismissed domestic violence incidents is incorrect because it fails to disclose a potentially disqualifying event. Minnesota law considers certain domestic violence incidents, even those without a conviction, as relevant to permit eligibility. This omission constitutes a failure to provide complete and truthful information, violating the spirit and letter of the law. Submitting an application without any mention of past domestic violence incidents, even if the applicant believes they were minor or resolved favorably, is incorrect. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of the comprehensive disclosure requirements and the potential implications of such history on permit eligibility. It is the applicant's responsibility to ensure all relevant information is presented. Claiming that only convictions matter and therefore dismissed incidents are irrelevant is incorrect. This interpretation is a misreading of Minnesota's permit to carry statutes. The law often looks beyond mere convictions to assess an individual's suitability to carry a firearm, and domestic violence history, in any form, is a significant factor. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this context should adopt a framework of absolute transparency and thoroughness when completing permit applications. This involves carefully reviewing all application questions, understanding the definitions of terms used, e.g., domestic violence, and erring on the side of disclosure when in doubt. Applicants should consult the relevant Minnesota statutes or seek clarification from the issuing authority if they are unsure about what information to provide. The guiding principle is to ensure the application is a complete and accurate reflection of their history as it pertains to firearm permit eligibility. Question 5. Performance analysis shows that applicants for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol sometimes struggle with applying the legal standards for the use of deadly force in a dynamic situation. Considering a scenario where an individual is observed acting erratically and aggressively in a public place, approaching the applicant's location, what is the most appropriate course of action for a permit holder to take? Option A. Assess the individual's actions for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, remaining aware and prepared to act defensively if necessary, while prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance if safe to do so. Option B. Immediately draw the firearm and confront the individual to prevent any potential escalation. Option C. Focus on the individual's past reputation or any perceived disrespect shown earlier in the day to justify a defensive posture. Option D. Assume the individual intends to cause harm due to their erratic behavior and seek to detain them until law enforcement arrives. The correct answer is A. Assess the individual's actions for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, remaining aware and prepared to act defensively if necessary, while prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance if safe to do so. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to demonstrate not only a theoretical understanding of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, but also the ability to apply them to a practical, albeit hypothetical, situation involving a potential threat. The applicant must navigate the nuances of self-defense laws, the definition of imminent danger, and the appropriate response within legal boundaries, all while under the pressure of an exam. Misinterpreting these laws can have severe, real-world consequences, making accurate application critical. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a clear and direct assessment of the immediate threat based on observable actions and the applicant's reasonable perception of danger. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance if possible, but recognizes the legal right to use force, including deadly force, when faced with an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. This aligns with Minnesota Statute Section 624(714), which permits the carrying of a pistol and outlines the conditions under which its use is justified, emphasizing the necessity of an immediate and unavoidable danger. The applicant's response should be proportionate to the threat and based on a reasonable belief that such force is necessary for self-preservation or the preservation of another. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming guilt or intent based solely on the individual's demeanor or perceived nervousness. Minnesota law does not permit preemptive action based on suspicion or a subjective feeling of unease. The threat must be imminent and demonstrable. Another incorrect approach is to rely on past grievances or potential future threats. The legal justification for using a firearm under a permit to carry is strictly limited to immediate, present danger, not past altercations or speculative future harm. A further incorrect approach is to engage in a verbal confrontation or attempt to apprehend the individual without a clear and present danger of death or great bodily harm. While de-escalation is encouraged, initiating a confrontation or acting as a vigilante is not permitted under the permit to carry statutes and could lead to criminal charges. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such scenarios by first identifying the core legal standard, imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. They should then evaluate the presented facts against this standard, considering observable actions and the reasonable perception of danger. The decision-making process should prioritize lawful self-defense, which includes the duty to retreat if safely possible, but also the right to use force when retreat is not feasible or safe. The focus must always be on the legality and proportionality of the response within the framework of Minnesota statutes. Question 6. Comparative studies suggest that applicants for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol often struggle with understanding the practical application of legal restrictions. Considering this, which approach best ensures an applicant is prepared to legally and ethically carry a firearm in Minnesota? Option A. Believe that the permit to carry is primarily a declaration of intent to carry a firearm, with minimal emphasis on specific location restrictions or legal justifications for use. Option B. Diligently study and internalize Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624 and Chapter 299A, focusing on prohibited locations and the legal standards for self-defense, and commit to strict adherence to these laws. Option C. Assume that permit to carry allows for firearm possession in all public and private spaces, as long as the permit is valid. Option D. Rely on advice from peers and online discussions to determine where carrying a pistol is permissible and when it is justified. The correct answer is B. Diligently study and internalize Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624 and Chapter 299A, focusing on prohibited locations and the legal standards for self-defense, and commit to strict adherence to these laws. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to demonstrate not only knowledge of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, but also the ability to apply them ethically and responsibly in a situation that could have serious legal and safety consequences. The applicant must navigate the nuances of when and where carrying a firearm is permissible and when it is not, understanding that a permit does not grant carte blanche to carry a weapon in all circumstances. Careful judgment is required to avoid violating the law and to ensure public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the applicant thoroughly reviewing and understanding Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections pertaining to carrying pistols, and Chapter 299A, which outlines the permit to carry process. This includes understanding the definitions of public place, private property, and the specific locations where carrying is prohibited, e.g., schools, courthouses, federal buildings, private property where notice is given. The applicant must internalize these legal boundaries and commit to adhering to them strictly, recognizing that their permit is conditional upon lawful conduct. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal requirements for obtaining and maintaining a permit to carry, ensuring the applicant is fully aware of their rights and responsibilities under Minnesota law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that possessing a permit to carry automatically grants the right to carry a firearm in any location, including those explicitly prohibited by statute. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the permit's limitations and the legal framework governing firearm possession. Is a failure to comply with Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, which clearly delineates prohibited carrying locations. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding carrying restrictions, rather than consulting the official Minnesota statutes. This approach is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the authoritative legal source, leading to potential misinterpretations and violations of the law. It prioritizes hearsay over established legal requirements. A third incorrect approach is to believe that the permit to carry is a license to use the firearm defensively in any situation, regardless of the immediate threat or legal justification. This overlooks the legal standards for self-defense in Minnesota, which require a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily harm. This approach fails to grasp the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with carrying a firearm, potentially leading to unlawful use of force. Professional reasoning. Professionals seeking a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota should adopt a proactive and diligent approach to legal education. This involves prioritizing official sources of information, such as the Minnesota statutes and the Department of Public Safety's guidelines. They should engage in a thorough review of all relevant laws and regulations, seeking clarification from official channels if any aspect is unclear. Furthermore, they must cultivate a mindset of responsible firearm ownership, understanding that the permit is a privilege that carries significant legal and ethical obligations. This commitment to understanding and adhering to the law is paramount for both personal safety and public well-being. Question 7. The investigation demonstrates that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a history of documented disputes and aggressive behavior, though no formal charges or convictions have resulted from these incidents. The permitting authority is concerned about the applicant's temperament. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the documented disputes and aggressive behavior to determine if they constitute a pattern that directly aligns with any disqualifying factors outlined in Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, and issue the permit if no such disqualifying factors are found, or deny it if they are. Option B. Request extensive personal background information unrelated to the specific statutory disqualifiers in Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713 to further assess the applicant's character. Option C. Deny the permit based on the general concern about the applicant's temperament and the documented history of disputes, as this suggests a potential risk to public safety. Option D. Issue the permit immediately without further investigation, assuming that the absence of formal charges means the applicant is eligible. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the documented disputes and aggressive behavior to determine if they constitute a pattern that directly aligns with any disqualifying factors outlined in Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, and issue the permit if no such disqualifying factors are found, or deny it if they are. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws in a situation where an individual's past behavior raises concerns about their current eligibility. The challenge lies in balancing the applicant's right to apply with the public safety mandate of the permitting authority, requiring careful judgment to avoid both unwarranted denial and the issuance of a permit to an ineligible person. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, objective, and documented review of all submitted information, supplemented by diligent investigation into any flagged concerns, strictly adhering to the criteria outlined in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624. This approach ensures that the decision is based on established legal standards and factual evidence, rather than speculation or bias. Specifically, Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, lists disqualifying factors. If the investigation reveals information that directly aligns with these statutory disqualifiers, e.g., a felony conviction, a domestic violence conviction, a pattern of violent behavior as evidenced by documented incidents, then denial is legally mandated. If the investigation yields no such disqualifying factors, the permit must be issued. The process must be transparent and documented to withstand scrutiny. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to deny the permit solely based on a generalized concern about the applicant's past behavior without concrete evidence linking that behavior to specific statutory disqualifiers. This fails to uphold the principle that denial must be based on established legal grounds, not subjective apprehension. It can lead to an arbitrary denial, violating the applicant's rights and potentially exposing the issuing authority to legal challenge. Another incorrect approach is to issue the permit without conducting a thorough investigation into the flagged concerns, assuming the applicant is eligible because they met the initial application requirements. This approach neglects the public safety responsibility inherent in the permitting process. If the flagged concerns, upon investigation, reveal a disqualifying factor under Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, issuing the permit would be a direct violation of the law and a significant risk to public safety. A third incorrect approach is to delay the decision indefinitely or request information far beyond the scope of what is legally permissible for determining eligibility under Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624. This can be seen as an attempt to avoid making a decision or as harassment of the applicant, neither of which is a legitimate function of the permitting process. Such delays can also be legally challenged. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and legally grounded decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the specific statutory criteria for permit issuance and denial in Minnesota. 2. Objectively evaluating all submitted application materials. 3. Conducting investigations that are targeted, relevant, and legally permissible, focusing on gathering evidence related to statutory disqualifiers. 4. Documenting every step of the investigation and the rationale for the final decision. 5. Making a decision that is solely based on whether the applicant meets the statutory requirements for eligibility or falls under a statutory disqualifier. Question 8. Regulatory review indicates that a sheriff's department is processing a permit to carry a pistol application. The applicant has a single prior misdemeanor conviction from 5 years ago for petty theft, which is unrelated to violence or firearms. The sheriff's department is considering denying the permit based on this prior offense, believing it indicates a general lack of trustworthiness. Which approach best aligns with Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol requirements? Option A. Grant the permit without further review, assuming that a minor, unrelated misdemeanor conviction does not constitute grounds for denial under Minnesota law. Option B. Deny the permit because any prior criminal offense, regardless of its nature or relevance, disqualifies an applicant from obtaining a permit to carry a pistol. Option C. Deny the permit based on a generalized concern that individuals with any past criminal record are inherently less trustworthy and therefore pose a higher risk when carrying a firearm. Option D. Review the applicant's entire history, including the petty theft conviction, to determine if it, in conjunction with other factors, demonstrates a reasonable fear of imminent danger to themselves or others, as required by statute. The correct answer is D. Review the applicant's entire history, including the petty theft conviction, to determine if it, in conjunction with other factors, demonstrates a reasonable fear of imminent danger to themselves or others, as required by statute. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, specifically concerning the interpretation of good cause and the potential for subjective bias in the application process. The sheriff's department has discretion, but this discretion must be exercised within the bounds of the law, not personal opinion or broad generalizations. The applicant's prior, unrelated minor offense, while not disqualifying on its face, introduces a layer of complexity that requires careful consideration of its relevance to current firearm suitability. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough and objective review of the applicant's history, focusing solely on whether the prior offense, in conjunction with all other available information, demonstrates a propensity for violence or a disregard for the law that would render the applicant a danger to themselves or others. This approach aligns with Minnesota Statute Section 624, 712, sub. 7, which defines good cause as a reasonable fear of imminent danger. The sheriff's department must assess if the applicant's past behavior, even if minor and unrelated to violence, creates a credible and articulable fear of future harm. If the offense does not suggest such a risk and no other disqualifying factors exist, the permit should be granted. This adheres to the principle that the permit is a right, not a privilege to be denied without due process, and a clear demonstration of disqualifying criteria. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to deny the permit solely based on the existence of any prior offense, regardless of its nature, severity, or recency, without a specific assessment of its relevance to current firearm suitability. This fails to adhere to the statutory definition of good cause and imposes an overly broad and potentially discriminatory standard. It presumes guilt or unsuitability based on past actions that may not indicate a present danger. Another incorrect approach would be to deny the permit based on a generalized, unsubstantiated fear that any individual with a past minor offense is inherently more likely to misuse a firearm. This relies on speculation and prejudice rather than objective evidence and a reasoned assessment of risk. It bypasses the requirement for a specific, articulable fear of imminent danger. A further incorrect approach would be to grant the permit without any review of the applicant's history, assuming that the absence of a disqualifying conviction automatically qualifies them. While the burden is on the state to show disqualification, the Sheriff's Department still has a duty to conduct a reasonable inquiry to ensure the applicant meets the good cause standard and is not a danger. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective legal standards over subjective biases. This involves 1. Understanding the specific statutory definitions and requirements, e.g., good cause, disqualifying factors. 2. Conducting a thorough and impartial review of all relevant information provided by the applicant and any other legally permissible sources. 3. Applying the law consistently and equitably to all applicants. 4. Documenting the decision-making process, clearly articulating the reasons for granting or denying a permit, with specific reference to the statutory criteria. 5. Recognizing that discretion must be exercised within legal boundaries, not as a tool for personal judgment or broad assumptions. Question 9. The analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a prior misdemeanor conviction for domestic assault. Considering Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, L, which prohibits individuals convicted of domestic violence-related offenses from possessing firearms, what is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Issue a provisional permit pending further investigation into the specifics of the domestic assault charge. Option B. Deny the permit application due to the statutory prohibition against individuals convicted of domestic violence-related offenses possessing firearms. Option C. Grant the permit, assuming a misdemeanor conviction does not pose a significant enough risk to disqualify the applicant. Option D. Grant the permit, but recommend that the applicant seek counseling for anger management. The correct answer is B. Deny the permit application due to the statutory prohibition against individuals convicted of domestic violence-related offenses possessing firearms. Explanation. The analysis reveals a scenario where an applicant for a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota has a past misdemeanor conviction for domestic assault. This presents a professional challenge because Minnesota law, specifically Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, L, prohibits individuals convicted of domestic violence-related offenses from possessing firearms. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying this statute to the applicant's specific conviction, ensuring that the licensing authority does not erroneously grant a permit to a prohibited individual, thereby compromising public safety and violating state law. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, specifically identifying any convictions for domestic violence-related offenses as defined by Minnesota statutes. This includes understanding that a misdemeanor conviction for domestic assault, as described, directly falls under the prohibition outlined in Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, L. Therefore, the licensing authority must deny the permit application based on this statutory disqualification. This approach is correct because it adheres strictly to the explicit language of Minnesota law, prioritizing public safety by preventing firearms from being possessed by individuals legally deemed a risk due to past domestic violence convictions. An incorrect approach would be to grant the permit based on the assumption that a misdemeanor conviction is not serious enough to warrant disqualification, or to overlook the specific nature of the domestic assault charge. This fails to recognize that Minnesota law broadly prohibits possession of firearms by individuals convicted of domestic violence-related offenses, regardless of the severity of the offense, misdemeanor vs. felony, as long as it meets the statutory definition. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on outdated or misinterpreted information about the applicant's record, or to apply a subjective standard of risk rather than the clear legal disqualification. These approaches are professionally unacceptable as they disregard the mandatory nature of the statutory prohibition, potentially leading to a dangerous outcome and a violation of legal duty. Professionals in this role should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of all applicable Minnesota statutes governing firearm permits. This includes meticulously examining each applicant's background, cross-referencing any criminal convictions against the disqualifying criteria outlined in Section 624. 713. When a potential disqualifier is identified, such as a domestic violence-related conviction, the process must involve a direct application of the statute's provisions without personal interpretation or subjective judgment. If there is any ambiguity regarding the nature of a conviction or its applicability to the statute, seeking clarification from legal counsel or the relevant prosecuting authority is a crucial step before making a final determination. Question 10. When evaluating the financial preparedness of an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol, what is the most accurate method for calculating the initial total cost of legally carrying a handgun? Option A. Only include the purchase price of the firearm. Option B. Sum the purchase price of the firearm, the cost of one box of ammunition, and the permit application fee. Option C. Add the permit application fee and the cost of a holster. Option D. Calculate the firearm purchase price, permit fee, and then add an arbitrary high estimate for ammunition. The correct answer is B. Sum the purchase price of the firearm, the cost of one box of ammunition, and the permit application fee. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the applicant to accurately calculate the total cost of firearm ownership, including not only the initial purchase price, but also ongoing expenses like ammunition and potential training. Miscalculating these costs could lead to an applicant either underestimating their financial commitment, potentially leading to future financial strain, or overestimating, causing unnecessary hesitation in pursuing their right to carry. The Minnesota permit to carry a pistol statute, while not directly dictating financial calculations for applicants, implies a responsibility for applicants to be prepared and informed. The professional challenge lies in ensuring the applicant demonstrates a realistic understanding of the financial implications of responsible firearm ownership, which is a component of overall preparedness. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a comprehensive calculation that accounts for the initial firearm purchase price, the cost of at least one box of ammunition, and the fee for the permit application. This method is correct because it directly addresses the immediate financial requirements for obtaining and initially equipping a firearm for carry, as implied by the preparedness expected of a permit holder. It aligns with the practical understanding of what is needed to legally carry a firearm. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to only consider the initial purchase price of the firearm. This fails to account for the essential ongoing cost of ammunition, which is necessary for the firearm to be functional for its intended purpose. It also ignores the mandatory permit application fee, a direct cost associated with legally carrying. Another incorrect approach is to calculate the cost of the firearm, permit fee, and then add an arbitrary, high number for ammunition without a basis. This demonstrates a lack of systematic calculation and could lead to an inflated or inaccurate total, failing to provide a realistic financial picture. A third incorrect approach is to only calculate the permit application fee and the cost of a holster. While a holster is important for safe carry, it does not represent the primary operational cost of the firearm itself or the ammunition needed to practice or use it. This approach overlooks the most significant financial components of firearm ownership and readiness. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such calculations with a focus on completeness and practicality. The decision-making process should involve identifying all direct and immediate costs associated with the intended activity. This includes the acquisition of the primary item, the necessary consumables, and any mandatory licensing or application fees. A systematic, step-by-step calculation ensures accuracy and provides a realistic financial assessment for the applicant. Question 11. Which approach would be most effective for an applicant seeking to obtain a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol, ensuring compliance with all statutory requirements and demonstrating responsible conduct throughout the application process? Option A. Focusing only on the most basic eligibility criteria, without considering the broader implications of the information provided or potential ambiguities in the law. Option B. Providing information based on assumptions about its correctness, without actively verifying its accuracy against official records or documentation. Option C. Thoroughly reviewing all application instructions and gathering all required documentation before submission, verifying the accuracy of all personal information and supporting materials. Option D. Submitting the application with incomplete information, intending to provide missing details once the initial submission is acknowledged by the issuing authority. Correct answer is C. Thoroughly reviewing all application instructions and gathering all required documentation before submission, verifying the accuracy of all personal information and supporting materials. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the complexities of the Minnesota permit to carry a pistol application process while ensuring all information provided is accurate and complete. Misrepresenting information, even unintentionally, can lead to denial of the permit and potential legal repercussions. The applicant must demonstrate a thorough understanding of the requirements and a commitment to honesty. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves meticulously reviewing all application instructions and gathering all required documentation before submitting the application. This includes verifying the accuracy of personal information, ensuring all necessary supporting documents are included, and understanding the legal definitions and requirements outlined by Minnesota law. This proactive and thorough method minimizes the risk of errors or omissions, directly aligning with the statutory requirement for an applicant to demonstrate they meet all eligibility criteria and are not disqualified under Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624. It prioritizes compliance and accuracy, which are paramount for a successful and lawful permit application. Incorrect approaches analysis. Submitting the application with incomplete information due to a rushed process, hoping to provide missing details later, fails to meet the initial completeness requirement of the application. This approach risks immediate denial and demonstrates a lack of due diligence, which is contrary to the expectation of a responsible firearm owner. Providing information that is believed to be correct but not verified, without taking steps to confirm its accuracy, introduces a significant risk of misrepresentation. Even if unintentional, submitting inaccurate information can be grounds for denial under Minnesota law, as it implies a failure to meet the burden of proof for eligibility. Focusing solely on the minimum requirements without considering potential ambiguities or the spirit of the law can lead to an incomplete or misleading application. This approach neglects the broader responsibility of demonstrating fitness to carry a pistol, which encompasses more than just ticking boxes. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach permit applications with a mindset of absolute accuracy and completeness. This involves a systematic process. First, thoroughly understanding all application instructions and relevant statutes. Second, gathering and verifying all required documentation. Third, completing the application truthfully and accurately. And finally, reviewing the entire submission for any potential errors or omissions before it is sent. This structured approach ensures compliance and demonstrates the applicant's commitment to responsible firearm ownership. Question 12. What factors determine an applicant's eligibility to carry a pistol in Minnesota beyond simply obtaining a permit? Option A. The applicant's belief that their permit should grant them the right to carry a pistol in any location they choose. Option B. The applicant's personal assessment of their need for self-defense in any given situation. Option C. A general understanding of firearm safety principles without specific knowledge of carrying restrictions. Option D. Strict adherence to all location-based prohibitions and restrictions as defined by Minnesota statutes, including those communicated through signage. The correct answer is D. Strict adherence to all location-based prohibitions and restrictions as defined by Minnesota statutes, including those communicated through signage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to demonstrate not only a foundational understanding of firearm safety, but also the ability to interpret and apply Minnesota statutes regarding the lawful carrying of a pistol. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legally permissible actions and those that could lead to permit denial or revocation, even if the applicant believes their intentions are benign. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions and circumstances align with legal requirements. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding of Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections pertaining to the carrying of a pistol. This includes recognizing that the permit is a privilege, not a right, and that certain locations and circumstances are explicitly prohibited for carrying a pistol, regardless of permit status. Adhering strictly to these statutory prohibitions, such as carrying in a school zone, courthouse, or a private establishment that has posted signage prohibiting firearms, is paramount. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the legal framework established by Minnesota law to ensure public safety and responsible firearm ownership. The permit is granted based on the applicant's ability to abide by these laws, and any deviation demonstrates a failure to meet the required standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that having a permit grants unrestricted carrying privileges anywhere a person wishes to go, as long as they are not actively engaged in criminal activity. This fails to acknowledge the specific location-based restrictions and prohibitions outlined in Minnesota statutes. Permit is not a blanket authorization for carrying a pistol in all public and private spaces. Another incorrect approach is to rely on personal interpretation of reasonable discretion, or self-defense necessity, to override explicit statutory prohibitions. Minnesota law provides clear guidelines on where carrying is prohibited, and personal judgment cannot supersede these established legal boundaries. The law does not grant permit holders the authority to decide when to ignore prohibitions based on their own assessment of risk. A further incorrect approach is to believe that ignorance of a specific prohibition, such as a posted sign at a business, serves as a valid defense for carrying a pistol in a prohibited area. Minnesota law places the responsibility on the permit holder to be aware of and comply with all restrictions, including those communicated through signage. Ignorance of the law is generally not a defense. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach permit applications and the responsibilities of carrying a pistol with a commitment to understanding and strictly adhering to Minnesota statutes. This involves proactive education on all applicable laws, including location-specific prohibitions and restrictions. When in doubt about the legality of carrying in a particular location or circumstance, the professional decision-making process should involve erring on the side of caution and refraining from carrying the firearm until legal clarity is obtained. This prioritizes legal compliance and public safety above personal convenience or perceived necessity. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a permit holder encountering a situation requiring the use of their firearm for self-defense, with a high potential severity of harm if such an encounter occurs. Considering Minnesota law, which of the following represents the most responsible and legally sound approach to preparing for and potentially responding to such a situation? Option A. Relying solely on the permit to carry as a guarantee of legal protection in any use of force scenario, without dedicating time to understanding specific legal statutes or maintaining firearm proficiency. Option B. Understanding Minnesota Statutes Chapter 609 regarding self-defense and defense of others, focusing on the legal requirements for justifiable use of deadly force, practicing safe firearm handling, and developing situational awareness to avoid or de-escalate conflict. Option C. Actively seeking out potentially dangerous situations to test one's preparedness and assert one's right to carry, assuming the permit provides a broad license for proactive engagement. Option D. Believing that carrying a permit to carry allows for the use of a firearm in any situation where one feels threatened, without strict adherence to the immediate threat of death or great bodily harm or the duty to retreat. The correct answer is B. Understanding Minnesota Statute Chapter 609 regarding self-defense and defense of others, focusing on the legal requirements for justifiable use of deadly force, practicing safe firearm handling, and developing situational awareness to avoid or de-escalate conflict. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a permit holder encountering a situation requiring the use of their firearm for self-defense, with a high potential severity of harm if such an encounter occurs. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to proactively consider and prepare for potential threats without succumbing to paranoia or excessive vigilance. Careful judgment is required to balance the right to self-defense with the responsibility to act lawfully and ethically. The best approach involves understanding the legal parameters of justifiable use of deadly force in Minnesota, as outlined in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 609, specifically sections related to self-defense and defense of others. This includes recognizing that the use of a firearm is a last resort, permissible only when there is an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, and that retreat is generally required if safely possible. Proactive preparation includes understanding these legal boundaries, practicing safe firearm handling, and developing situational awareness to de-escalate or avoid conflict whenever feasible. This approach prioritizes lawful conduct and minimizes the risk of legal repercussions and unintended harm. An incorrect approach involves assuming that carrying a permit to carry automatically grants broad authority to use a firearm in any perceived threat, regardless of the imminence or severity of danger, or the duty to retreat. This disregards Minnesota law, which strictly defines the circumstances under which deadly force is justified. Another incorrect approach is to become overly fearful and constantly seek out or provoke confrontations, believing that the permit justifies aggressive behavior. This not only violates ethical responsibilities, but also increases the likelihood of unlawful use of force and negative legal outcomes. Finally, neglecting to stay informed about current Minnesota laws regarding self-defense and firearm use, or failing to maintain proficiency in safe firearm handling, represents a failure to uphold the responsibilities that come with carrying a permit. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the legal framework governing the use of force. This should be coupled with continuous development of situational awareness and conflict avoidance skills. When faced with a potential threat, the framework dictates an immediate assessment of the imminence and severity of danger, followed by an evaluation of whether a safe retreat is possible. Only when all other safe options are exhausted, and there is an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, should the use of a firearm be considered, and even then, only to the extent necessary to neutralize the threat. Question 14. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a past juvenile adjudication for an offense that, if committed by an adult, would be a felony. The applicant believes this adjudication is not relevant to their current eligibility because it occurred many years ago and was handled in juvenile court. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with Minnesota's permit to carry requirements? Option A. Rely on advice from online forums and friends to determine if the juvenile adjudication needs to be disclosed. Option B. Only disclose past legal issues that are explicitly listed as disqualifying on the permit application form itself. Option C. Proactively disclose the juvenile adjudication on the permit application and provide any available documentation regarding its resolution or the applicant's current legal standing. Option D. Assume the juvenile adjudication is not disqualifying because it was handled in juvenile court and omit it from the application. The correct answer is C. Proactively disclose the juvenile adjudication on the permit application and provide any available documentation regarding its resolution or the applicant's current legal standing. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, specifically concerning the definition of eligible and the process for addressing disqualifying factors. A superficial understanding can lead to misinterpretations of eligibility and unnecessary delays or denials. Careful judgment is required to ensure all legal requirements are met accurately and truthfully. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves the applicant proactively and truthfully disclosing any past legal issues that might be construed as disqualifying, even if they believe the issue is resolved or not applicable. This approach aligns with Minnesota Statute Section 624(713), which outlines the grounds for permit denial, including certain convictions and adjudications. By disclosing and providing context or documentation of resolution, the applicant demonstrates transparency and allows the issuing authority to make an informed decision based on the full picture, rather than risking a denial based on an incomplete or misleading application. This proactive disclosure is crucial for demonstrating good moral character, a factor often implicitly considered in permit applications. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a past legal issue, such as a juvenile adjudication for a crime that would be a felony if committed by an adult, is automatically not disqualifying without verifying its specific impact under Minnesota law. Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, sub 1b. 3. Specifically addresses juvenile adjudications for certain offenses. Failing to disclose such an adjudication, even if the applicant believes it is expunged or irrelevant, can lead to a denial or revocation of the permit for providing false information on the application. Another incorrect approach is to only disclose legal issues that the applicant believes are explicitly listed as disqualifying in the permit application form itself, without consulting the relevant statutes. The application form may not be exhaustive, and Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713 provides the definitive criteria. Overlooking or misinterpreting statutory language regarding disqualifications, such as those related to domestic violence or certain mental health adjudications, can result in an incomplete application and a denial. A third incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding eligibility without consulting the official Minnesota statutes or the issuing authority. Legal requirements for firearm permits are precise, and informal advice is often inaccurate or incomplete, failing to account for specific legal nuances or recent legislative changes. This can lead to a misunderstanding of what constitutes a disqualifying factor and a failure to provide necessary documentation or explanations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach permit applications with a commitment to full disclosure and diligent research. This involves 1. Thoroughly reviewing the relevant Minnesota statutes, Section 624, 713 and related sections, to understand all potential disqualifying factors. 2. Honestly and completely answering all questions on the application, disclosing any past legal issues, even if they believe they are not disqualifying or have been resolved. 3. Providing supporting documentation for any disclosed issues, such as court records showing resolution or expungement, if applicable. 4. Consulting directly with the Sheriff's Office or the Minnesota Department of Public Safety if there are any ambiguities regarding eligibility or disclosure requirements. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol is seeking the most efficient and legally sound method to initiate their application. Considering the procedural requirements outlined in Minnesota statutes, which of the following actions represents the most appropriate first step? Option A. Complete the official permit to carry a pistol application form and submit it, along with all required supporting documentation, to the Sheriff's Office in their county of residence. Option B. Begin carrying their handgun openly in public while awaiting information on the permit application process. Option C. Contact a local gun shop to inquire about the general process and obtain advice on necessary paperwork. Option D. Assume that since they legally own a handgun, they are permitted to carry it concealed without a formal permit. The correct answer is A. Complete the official permit to carry a pistol application form and submit it, along with all required supporting documentation, to the Sheriff's Office in their county of residence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the procedural requirements for a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota, while also demonstrating an understanding of the underlying legal principles that govern such permits. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the correct sequence of actions and the necessary documentation. Ensuring compliance with Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections related to permits to carry. Misinterpreting or overlooking any step can lead to delays, denial, or even legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to prioritize the official application process and adhere strictly to the outlined procedures. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves directly engaging with the official application process as prescribed by Minnesota law. This means completing the required application form, undergoing the mandated background check, and submitting all necessary documentation to the Sheriff's Office in the applicant's county of residence. This approach is correct because Minnesota Statute Section 624, 714, Subdivision 6 clearly outlines the application process, including the requirement to apply to the county sheriff, undergo a background check, and provide specific information. Adhering to this statutory framework ensures that the applicant is following the legally mandated steps for obtaining a permit. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves attempting to bypass the formal application process by seeking informal advice or relying on general knowledge without consulting the official application materials or the sheriff's office. This fails to meet the statutory requirements for a formal application and background check, which are critical for public safety and legal compliance under Minnesota law. Another incorrect approach is to assume that possessing a firearm legally for other purposes automatically grants the right to carry it openly or concealed without a permit. Minnesota Statute Section 624, 714 explicitly requires a permit to carry a pistol, and this right is not implied by mere ownership. A further incorrect approach is to submit incomplete or inaccurate information on the application form. This directly violates the requirement for truthful and complete disclosure mandated by the application process and can lead to denial of the permit, as well as potential penalties for providing false information under oath. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by prioritizing adherence to the specific statutory requirements of Minnesota law. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the governing statute, Minnesota Statute Section 624, 714. 2. Understanding the prescribed application procedure, including the responsible authority county sheriff and required steps, application, background check, documentation. 3. Recognizing that all legal requirements must be met precisely as outlined, without shortcuts or assumptions. 4. Consulting official resources and the relevant authorities for clarification. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a past misdemeanor conviction for a domestic-related offense that occurred 5 years ago, for which they completed all court-ordered probation. The applicant believes this conviction should not prevent them from obtaining a permit because it was a misdemeanor, and they have since demonstrated good behavior. Which of the following approaches best reflects the applicant's responsibility in addressing this situation for their permit application? Option A. Assume that since the conviction was a misdemeanor and probation is complete, it will not be a disqualifying factor and therefore does not require specific mention or detailed explanation on the application. Option B. Rely on general advice from friends who have obtained permits, assuming their experiences with past minor legal issues are similar and will not impact this application. Option C. Thoroughly research Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624, specifically sections pertaining to disqualifying convictions for permit to carry a pistol, to determine if the domestic-related misdemeanor conviction is a statutory bar to obtaining a permit, and be prepared to provide documentation of probation completion. Option D. Focus on highlighting their current responsible firearm ownership practices and positive community involvement, believing these factors will outweigh any past minor legal issues. Correct answer is C. Thoroughly research Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections pertaining to disqualifying convictions for permit to carry a pistol, to determine if the domestic-related misdemeanor conviction is a statutory bar to obtaining a permit, and be prepared to provide documentation of probation completion. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an applicant to accurately recall and apply specific Minnesota statutes governing the permit to carry a pistol. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legally permissible actions and those that constitute violations, even if seemingly minor or unintentional. Misinterpreting these statutes can lead to denial of the permit or, worse, criminal charges if a permit is obtained and then misused. Careful judgment is required to ensure all application requirements are met and that the applicant understands their responsibilities under Minnesota law. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a thorough review of Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, specifically sections related to the permit to carry a pistol, and understanding the definitions and prohibitions outlined therein. This includes familiarizing oneself with the grounds for denial or revocation of a permit, such as felony convictions, certain misdemeanor convictions, orders for protection, and chemical dependency. An applicant demonstrating this approach understands that their past conduct and current circumstances are subject to strict legal scrutiny under Minnesota law. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework established by the state for permit issuance and ensures compliance with all statutory requirements. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on general knowledge of firearm safety or personal beliefs about gun ownership without consulting the specific Minnesota statutes. This fails to address the precise legal criteria set forth by the state, potentially leading to an applicant overlooking disqualifying factors or misunderstanding prohibited carrying locations. Another incorrect approach is to assume that minor past infractions, such as a dismissed disorderly conduct charge, are irrelevant without verifying their impact under Minnesota law. Some offenses, even if not resulting in a conviction, can still be grounds for denial if they indicate a propensity for violence or a lack of good moral character as defined by statute. Finally, an approach that focuses only on the physical act of carrying a pistol and neglects the legal requirements for obtaining and maintaining the permit is fundamentally flawed. The permit process is not merely about the ability to carry, but about demonstrating legal eligibility and adherence to all state regulations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach permit applications by prioritizing a comprehensive understanding of the governing statutes. This involves actively seeking out and studying the relevant legal text, rather than relying on assumptions or incomplete information. When in doubt about the interpretation or application of a statute, consulting official state resources or legal counsel is advisable. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to full disclosure and strict adherence to all legal requirements, recognizing that the permit is a privilege granted under specific legal conditions. Question 17. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol is preparing their application. They have gathered most of the required documents, but are unsure about a minor detail regarding a past minor legal infraction that might be relevant. They consider submitting the application with this detail omitted, assuming the sheriff's office will request clarification if needed. Or they could rely on advice from a friend who also has a permit. What is the most responsible and legally compliant approach for this applicant? Option A. Rely on the advice of a friend who has a permit to determine how to handle the omission of the minor infraction. Option B. Submit the application with the infraction omitted and address it only if directly questioned by the sheriff's office during the application review. Option C. Thoroughly research Minnesota statutes related to permit eligibility and any potential impact of past infractions, and contact the local sheriff's office for specific guidance on how to accurately report the infraction before submitting the application. Option D. Submit the application with the minor infraction omitted, assuming the sheriff's office will follow up if the information is critical. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research Minnesota statutes related to permit eligibility and any potential impact of past infractions, and contact the local sheriff's office for specific guidance on how to accurately report the infraction before submitting the application. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the complexities of the Minnesota permit to carry a pistol application process while ensuring all information provided is accurate and complete. Misrepresenting information, even unintentionally, can lead to denial of the permit and potential legal repercussions. The applicant must understand the specific requirements and demonstrate a commitment to responsible firearm ownership. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and honest self-assessment of eligibility criteria and a meticulous review of all required documentation before submission. This approach ensures that the applicant fully understands the legal requirements for obtaining a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota, as outlined in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624, specifically sections related to permits to carry. By proactively gathering and verifying all necessary information, including any potential disqualifying factors, the applicant demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to adhering to the law. This aligns with the ethical obligation of an applicant to be truthful and transparent with law enforcement agencies responsible for permit issuance. Incorrect approach is analysis. Submitting an application with incomplete information due to an assumption that missing details will be requested later is a regulatory failure. Minnesota law requires a complete application to be submitted for consideration. Failing to provide all required information upfront can lead to the application being rejected or significantly delayed, as it does not meet the statutory requirements for processing. Providing information that is inaccurate or misleading, even if not intentionally deceptive, constitutes a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624 mandates that applicants provide truthful and accurate information. Misrepresentation can result in the denial of the permit and potential criminal charges, undermining the integrity of the permitting process designed to ensure public safety. Relying solely on informal advice from friends or online forums without consulting official Minnesota statutes or the sheriff's office is an ethically questionable approach. While informal advice might seem helpful, it can be inaccurate or incomplete, leading to a misunderstanding of the legal requirements. This can result in an application that is doomed to fail or, worse, an applicant who believes they are compliant when they are not, creating a dangerous situation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach the permit to carry application process with a mindset of proactive compliance and thoroughness. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements of Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624. 2. Conducting a comprehensive self-assessment of eligibility. 3. Gathering all required documentation accurately and completely. 4. Consulting official sources, Sheriff's Office, Minnesota statutes for clarification. 5. Submitting the application with absolute honesty and accuracy. Question 18. Process analysis reveals that an applicant for a Minnesota permit to carry a pistol has a past misdemeanor conviction for domestic assault that occurred several years ago. The applicant believes this conviction might be a disqualifier under federal law, but is unsure if it specifically prohibits them from obtaining a Minnesota permit. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action for this applicant when completing the permit application? Option A. Fully disclose the misdemeanor conviction on the application form and be prepared to provide any requested documentation, understanding that the sheriff's office will assess eligibility based on all applicable state and federal laws. Option B. Rely on advice from friends or online forums that suggest certain misdemeanor convictions are not typically enforced for state permits and proceed with the application based on that informal guidance. Option C. Only research federal disqualifiers for firearm possession and assume that if they are not federally prohibited, they are eligible for a Minnesota permit. Option D. Omit the misdemeanor conviction from the application, assuming that if it's not explicitly listed as a disqualifier in the primary Minnesota statute, it is not relevant for the state permit. The correct answer is A. Fully disclose the misdemeanor conviction on the application form and be prepared to provide any requested documentation, understanding that the sheriff's office will assess eligibility based on all applicable state and federal laws. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, specifically concerning the definition of eligible and the implications of past legal entanglements. A superficial understanding of the law can lead to misrepresentation or omission, jeopardizing the permit application and potentially leading to legal consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure full compliance with statutory requirements and to accurately represent one's background. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and honest disclosure of all relevant information, even if the applicant believes it may not be disqualifying. This approach directly aligns with Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, which outlines the grounds for denial of a permit. Specifically, the statute requires an applicant to be eligible to possess a firearm. While a past misdemeanor conviction for domestic assault might be a disqualifying factor under federal law, 18 U.S.C. Section 922G. 9. Minnesota law also has its own specific prohibitions. An applicant must proactively address any potential disqualifications by consulting the relevant statutes and, if necessary, seeking legal counsel to understand their current eligibility status. Full and truthful disclosure on the application form, including any past convictions, is paramount. This ensures the sheriff's office has all necessary information to make an informed decision based on Minnesota's specific criteria. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that a past misdemeanor conviction, even if not explicitly listed as a disqualifier in the initial review of Minnesota Statute Section 624. 713, Subdivision 1, can be omitted. This is a failure to adhere to the spirit and intent of the law, which aims to ensure that only eligible individuals are granted permits. The Sheriff's Office conducts a background check that will likely uncover such convictions. An omission is considered a misrepresentation on the application, which is a separate offense. Another incorrect approach is to only consider federal disqualifiers and ignore potential state-specific prohibitions. While federal law is important, Minnesota has its own set of criteria for permit eligibility. Relying solely on a federal assessment without considering Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, and its specific prohibitions, which may include certain types of misdemeanors or other offenses not covered by federal law, is insufficient and can lead to an inaccurate assessment of eligibility. A third incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding eligibility. Legal requirements for firearm permits are precise and can have significant consequences if misinterpreted. Such informal advice lacks the authority and accuracy of official legal interpretation or consultation with the Sheriff's Office or legal counsel. This approach bypasses the due diligence required to understand the specific legal landscape of Minnesota's permit to carry laws. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach permit applications with a commitment to absolute transparency and a thorough understanding of the governing statutes. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying all potential legal disqualifiers under both federal and state law. 2. Consulting the exact text of Minnesota Statute Section 624, 713, Subdivision 1, and any related case law or administrative guidance. 3. If there is any ambiguity or concern about past legal issues, proactively seeking clarification from the issuing sheriff's office or qualified legal counsel before submitting the application. 4. Completing the application form with complete and truthful information, disclosing all relevant details, even if they seem minor or potentially disqualifying. This proactive and honest approach minimizes risk and ensures compliance. Question 19. Process analysis reveals that a Minnesota County Sheriff's Office is reviewing an application for a permit to carry a pistol. The applicant has a past misdemeanor conviction for disorderly conduct that occurred 10 years ago, for which they completed all sentencing requirements. The Sheriff's Office is considering denying the permit based on a general concern about the applicant's past behavior, despite the conviction not being a felony or a crime specifically listed as a disqualifier in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624, which approach best aligns with the legal requirements for issuing a permit to carry a pistol in Minnesota. Option A. Deny the permit based on a subjective assessment that the disorderly conduct conviction, even if a misdemeanor and not a listed disqualifier, indicates a character trait that makes the applicant unsuitable to carry a pistol. Option B. Deny the permit because the applicant has a criminal conviction, regardless of its nature or the time elapsed, as all past convictions are considered grounds for disqualification. Option C. Issue the permit because the applicant's past conviction does not meet the specific disqualifying criteria outlined in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 624, and the applicant has fulfilled all sentencing requirements. Option D. Delay the decision indefinitely to conduct further informal inquiries into the applicant's current lifestyle and associations, beyond what is required by statute. Correct answer is C. Issue the permit because the applicant's past conviction does not meet the specific disqualifying criteria outlined in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624, and the applicant has fulfilled all sentencing requirements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to navigate the nuances of Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws, specifically concerning the definition of eligible and the implications of past legal entanglements. The applicant must accurately assess their own situation against the statutory requirements, and the licensing authority must diligently apply these laws without bias or misinterpretation. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the licensing authority's decision is based solely on the legal criteria established by Minnesota statutes, not on assumptions or external pressures. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and objective review of the applicant's history against the specific disqualifying factors outlined in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624. This approach prioritizes adherence to the letter of the law. Specifically, the licensing authority must determine if the applicant has been convicted of a crime that disqualifies them under the statute, or if they fall under any other statutory prohibition, e.g., domestic violence restraining orders, certain mental health adjudications. If the applicant's record, when objectively assessed against these statutes, does not present a disqualifying factor, the permit should be issued. This is correct because Minnesota law mandates that permits be issued to applicants who meet the statutory qualifications and are not disqualified by specific prohibitions. The focus is on objective legal criteria, not subjective interpretations of character or perceived future risk beyond what the statute defines. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to deny the permit based on a subjective interpretation of the applicant's past behavior, even if that behavior does not directly correspond to a statutory disqualifier. This fails to adhere to the principle that disqualification must be based on specific legal grounds enumerated in the statute. It introduces an element of personal judgment that is not permitted by the law, potentially leading to arbitrary denial. Another incorrect approach is to grant the permit without a proper review of the applicant's criminal history or other relevant records that could trigger a statutory disqualification. This is a failure of due diligence and a direct violation of the licensing authority's responsibility to ensure that only eligible individuals receive a permit. It undermines public safety by potentially issuing permits to individuals who are legally prohibited from carrying a pistol. A third incorrect approach is to deny the permit based on information obtained from sources outside of official records or statutory criteria, such as unsubstantiated rumors or hearsay. This is procedurally unfair to the applicant and legally unsound, as Minnesota law specifies the grounds for disqualification, which must be supported by verifiable evidence. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this role must adopt a systematic and legally grounded decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the precise requirements and disqualifiers outlined in Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 624. 2. Conducting a comprehensive and objective review of all available official records pertaining to the applicant. 3. Applying the statutory criteria strictly to the facts presented by the records, without introducing personal biases or subjective interpretations. 4. Documenting the decision-making process thoroughly, referencing the specific statutory provisions that support the conclusion. If there is any ambiguity regarding statutory interpretation, seeking legal counsel is advisable. The ultimate goal is to ensure that the decision is legally defensible and upholds both the applicant's rights and public safety. Question 20. Process analysis reveals that permit to carry a pistol training course in Minnesota requires a minimum of 10 distinct drills, with each drill allowing for a maximum of 15 rounds of ammunition to be expended. To ensure adequate preparation for the practical portion of the examination, what is the minimum total number of rounds that must be available for the applicant to successfully complete all required drills at their maximum capacity? Option A, 150 rounds. Option B, 200 rounds. Option C, 25 rounds. Option D, 50 rounds. The correct answer is A, 150 rounds. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in accurately calculating the required ammunition capacity for a specific training scenario, directly impacting compliance with Minnesota's permit to carry a pistol laws and the safe execution of training. Miscalculation could lead to insufficient ammunition for effective training or, conversely, exceeding legal limits, both of which have serious implications for the applicant's understanding of responsible firearm ownership and the instructor's adherence to training standards. The core challenge lies in applying the syllabus's quantitative requirements to a practical, albeit hypothetical, training exercise. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise calculation of the total rounds needed based on the syllabus's specified number of drills and the maximum rounds per drill. This approach ensures that the training meets the minimum requirements without exceeding them, demonstrating a thorough understanding of the syllabus's quantitative mandates. Specifically, the syllabus requires a minimum of 10 drills, with a maximum of 15 rounds per drill. To determine the minimum total rounds, one multiplies the minimum number of drills by the maximum rounds per drill. 10 drills * 15 rounds / drill equals 150 rounds. This calculation directly adheres to the syllabus's parameters, ensuring sufficient ammunition for effective training while remaining within the specified limits. This meticulous approach reflects a commitment to both the letter and spirit of the training requirements, promoting safety and proficiency. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves simply adding the maximum rounds per drill to the minimum number of drills. 15 plus 10 equals 25 rounds. This fails to account for the total number of drills required and the cumulative nature of ammunition expenditure across multiple exercises. It fundamentally misunderstands how to calculate total quantity from per unit maximums and minimums. Another incorrect approach is to calculate the total rounds by multiplying the minimum drills by a rounded-up number of rounds that is not explicitly stated as a maximum for all drills, such as assuming 20 rounds per drill. 10 drills * 20 rounds/drill equals 200 rounds. This introduces an arbitrary figure not supported by the syllabus and potentially exceeds the spirit of the maximum rounds per drill, leading to an inefficient or overly generous ammunition allocation. A further incorrect approach is to calculate the total rounds by multiplying the minimum drills by the minimum rounds per drill, if a minimum per drill were specified, or by a single, arbitrary number of rounds that doesn't reflect the syllabus's constraints. For instance, if the syllabus stated a minimum of 5 rounds per drill and a maximum of 15, and one calculated 10 drills * 5 rounds/drill equals 50 rounds, this would fail to ensure sufficient practice if the instructor intended to utilize the higher end of the allowed rounds for certain drills to simulate realistic scenarios. The correct approach must consider the maximum allowed rounds per drill to ensure the training is robust enough to meet the syllabus's intent. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such calculations by first identifying all quantitative parameters within the syllabus. They must then determine the appropriate mathematical operation, multiplication in this case, to combine these parameters to arrive at the required total. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to the syllabus's explicit limits, ensuring that the calculated quantity is both sufficient for effective training and compliant with all stated regulations. When faced with minimum and maximum values, the calculation should typically use the minimum number of required actions and the maximum allowance per action to ensure the training is comprehensive and meets the highest reasonable standard within the given constraints.